All right, so you've brought a whole stack of CBRN World for us to get through. This one is, let me see, December 2023. Wow, so this is like hot off the presses stuff. You're really dialed into this world, huh? And we're not just talking theory here. It seems like this is the really practical side of CBRN. So what's caught your eye in this issue?
Well, what's really interesting about this particular issue is they've got all these different experts, right? People from government, from the military, from academia, who are really on the front lines of this stuff. And they're all kind of weighing in on what they see as the biggest CBRN challenges going into 2024.
So a real brain trust here, weighing in on the big questions. So what's got them worried? What are the headlines?
Well, one of the things that comes up again and again is Russia. Specifically, their actions that seem to be kind of undermining those international arms control agreements, like the Biological Weapons Convention, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the Chemical Weapons Convention. I mean, these are the things that are supposed to prevent, some of the worst case scenarios imaginable.
Yeah, it's more than just bureaucratic paperwork. These are safeguards against some truly terrifying weapons. And what are the experts saying about, those potential hotspots we're always hearing about? Ukraine, the Middle East.
Right. I mean, there's definitely a lot of concern about the potential for those existing conflicts to escalate. And, the risk of nuclear proliferation is huge, especially with North Korea continuing to expand their arsenal. And then you've got Iran's nuclear program that's advancing.
And then, there's this whole other angle that's, well, kind of unsettling, to be honest. The experts are really raising the alarm about what they're calling cyber biological and cyber chemical threats. They even brought up that incident you remember back in 2021 with the attempted water supply poisoning in Florida.
Right. And that really was a wake-up call. It just shows how vulnerable our critical infrastructure is to this kind of attack. I mean, can you imagine someone, remotely hacking into a system and trying to taint the water supply? It's a pretty frightening thought. And it's not just state actors we're talking about here either. The idea of terrorist groups gaining these kinds of capabilities is a really scary thought.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about terrorist groups and how they're constantly looking for ways to inflict mass casualties, those kinds of cyber-enabled attacks would be a terrifying new tool in their arsenal. So are we just doomed? I mean, is it just a matter of time?
No, not necessarily. I mean, while these threats are definitely real and they are serious, the experts all emphasize the importance of preparedness. We're talking about strengthening our cybersecurity, developing countermeasures, improving international cooperation. All of these things are key. And, we really can't forget the lessons we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. We have got to be more prepared for the next one.
Yeah, if anything, COVID-19 really drove home just how interconnected our world is and, what the devastating impact a global pandemic can have. Speaking of lessons and frankly, the urgency of all this, one statement really jumped out at me. Brigadier General Rhett William King, he said, "The U.S. must meet this challenge with enthusiasm, discipline, and fortitude. The window to seize strategic initiative is now."
And that really sums up the sentiment, doesn't it? These experts aren't just ringing alarm bells. They're saying, like, look, we need to act, and we need to act now. They really believe that we have a window of opportunity here to get ahead of some of these threats. But that window is closing.
Okay, so we've got the 30,000-foot view, right? The big picture of the CBRN landscape as these experts see it going into 2024. But these CBRA World articles, they don't stop there. They really get into the weeds, the really specific areas. It's like they're giving us a toolkit for how to actually get practical about these threats.
Yeah, and it's not just the big picture stuff either,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they really get into the weeds on some of these specific areas. And that's where it gets, really interesting, I think. Like take AI, for example.
Oh, yeah, AI. It's like the big thing these days, right? But, when you're talking about CBRN, it seems like it's one of those kind of double-edged sword situations.
Totally. I mean, on the one hand, you've got AI revolutionizing life sciences research,
Right?
speeding things up, new drug discoveries, all that. But that same power, it can be misused.
Like for designing entirely new bioweapons or even just making it easier for the bad guys to get their hands on, dangerous information.
Exactly. Think about it. You could have an AI algorithm that's capable of designing completely novel biological agents, or even just tweaking existing ones just enough to kind of slip past those international regulations we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so how would that work? Give me an example.
Well, pick fentanyl, for instance. It's one of the most dangerous substances out there, right?
Yeah.
But imagine if you used AI to design a fentanyl derivative.
A derivative.
Yeah, so basically you make a tiny change at the molecular level, and suddenly you've got something that's potentially just as dangerous, but it's not specifically listed on any of those banned lists because technically it's a new thing. And that kind of thing, that's what AI could make, well, frighteningly easy.
Yeah, that's a pretty disturbing thought. So, are we just powerless then? I mean, if AI is that powerful, how do we even begin to counter that threat?
Well, it's not about being powerless. It's about being proactive.
Right.
We need to be thinking about like new safeguards, new norms for how AI is developed and used in these fields, like really strong identity verification for anyone who's accessing these, really powerful biological design tools,
Hmm?
ways to monitor how they're being used, maybe even like kill switches or something if someone is suspected of, having malicious intent.
It's almost like we need an AI watchdog for AI itself.
Right.
Okay, enough of the scary stuff for a second. Let's switch gears to something, well, completely different. Cold weather CBRN. That article about was it the Norwegian Armed Forces CBRN school?
Yes, the Norwegian Armed Forces CBRN and Emergency Protection School.
That was fascinating. I mean, I'd honestly never really thought about how extreme cold could impact, well, everything. From how your equipment performs to, like, literally how those chemical agents behave.
Yeah, it's a huge factor. And it really does impact everything, like even just simple things. Yeah. Batteries drain way faster in the cold. Those LCD screens on all your equipment, they get less responsive. I even read that like the membranes in respirators can freeze, which obviously, throws a wrench into things.
So it's all about adaptation, though.
Absolutely. The Norwegians, they have this very practical approach. It's all about like train as you fight. They teach their people to adapt their procedures, understand the limitations of their gear in those conditions, and just, constant vigilance. They have this great saying, if in doubt, deacon. If not in doubt, deacon. It is always deacon.
I mean, it's hard to argue with that, especially when you think about what you were saying earlier about how some of these liquid chemical agents, they can actually vaporize and become even more dangerous as they warm up. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about public decontamination. What really struck me here was how much emphasis they put on the human element, like the psychology of how people actually behave in these really high-stress situations.
Right, and that's something that's often overlooked.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely critical. There's this almost automatic assumption that in a CBRN event, people just going to panic.
Mm-hmm.
But the research actually suggests that that's not always the case.
Really?
Yeah, in fact, they were saying that even using the term panic, it can be kind of counterproductive.
How so?
Well, because it kind of assumes irrational behavior, right?
Yeah.
And that can actually hinder communication and cooperation, which is the exact opposite of what you need in those situations. Instead, they're really pushing this idea of collective resilience, recognizing that in a crisis, a lot of people, they actually want to help. They want to be useful. There was even this suggestion in one of the articles about like enlisting members of the public to help out with, simple tasks during a decontamination process.
It's like you're channeling that nervous energy, that desire to help, and turning it into something positive. Smart. Okay, so we've talked theory, we've talked about the practical side of things. But how does this all actually play out in the real world? I mean, these articles had some pretty intense case studies.
Oh, yeah, definitely. One that comes to mind is that Bijlmer air crash back in 1992 in Amsterdam.
Vaguely ringing a bell. Remind me.
So an El cargo plane crashed into an apartment building. Huge tragedy, obviously. But then on top of everything else, they found traces of DMMP, that's a chemical used to make sarin gas, and depleted uranium on board.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember that now. It caused a huge uproar, right? People were convinced something was being covered up.
It really sent the conspiracy theorists into overdrive. But this article actually does a good job of kind of picking apart those theories and offering a much more, well, plausible explanation. It turns out the DMMP was most likely being used for testing gas mask filters. Pretty standard procedure, apparently. And the depleted uranium, that was being used as counterweights in some military equipment. It's a good reminder that sometimes things that seem really suspicious in a civilian context are actually pretty routine in the military world.
Yeah, it's easy to jump to conclusions when you don't have all the information. Speaking of real-world experiences, that account from the Ukrainian firefighter Volodymyr Dubasyuk, intense. I mean, here's a guy battling this massive diesel fuel fire caused by a rocket attack, and all the while there's the threat of more strikes coming in. Talk about bravery.
Yeah, his story really highlights, the incredible challenges that those first responders are facing over there in a war zone. It's not just the immediate dangers they're dealing with, but also, like you said, that constant threat of chemical or radiological contamination. Really underscores the importance of things like international collaboration, humanitarian aid, anything that can help bolster Ukraine's ability to respond to these kinds of events.
Absolutely. And on a lighter note, no pun intended, while we're talking about tools and tech, I noticed this issue had a pretty hefty section on like the latest and greatest in CBRN detection and protection equipment. Anything catch your eye in there?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
They had a really cool piece on the FLIR Griffin G510X GCMS. It's used for narcotics and explosives detection. Seems pretty cutting edge. And then Smith's detection, they've got some new chemical sensors coming out that seem really promising. Oh, and I almost forgot ProEngine. They're doing some interesting things with flame spectrometry-based detectors. It's amazing to see how technology is constantly evolving to give those first responders better, safer ways to do their jobs.
After spending time with this issue of CBRN World, it's clear to me that this is a complex world and it's changing all the time, but it's also clear that there are a lot of smart, dedicated people out there working hard to stay one step ahead of these threats. Thanks for bringing this issue to our attention and for walking us through it.
Absolutely. It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive. And, it makes you wonder, what are we doing to prepare for the CBRN challenges of the future? Are we thinking creatively enough? Are we collaborating enough? I think that's something for all of us to ponder.